Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Crime Centric. This being a show where I talk about TV shows that are crime dramas. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the season premiere of Only Murders in the Building. Great season premiere. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. I actually did not know Meryl Streep was going to be in this season until she popped up. I saw like a preview that had her in it. I was like, I had no idea she was going to be in this season. But the moment they introduced that character and we're seeing her like get older and, she was fascinated by the stage and she was kind of waiting for her moment, and sadly it never happened. But the moment we kept seeing the character from like behind or whatever, I was like, is that going to be Meryl Streep's character? I was like, it'd be funny if, I forgot how many children she has, but I was like, because I know at least I became recently familiar with one of her daughters because her daughter, I'm blinking on the character's name, but she was in the show Let the Right One In. She was in Let the Right One In, which I did not know she was Meryl Streep's daughter until I looked into it. But it's like in retrospect, it's like, oh yeah, like when you look at their faces, like they look a lot alike. I was almost wondering if they were going to cast her daughter as like a younger version of herself because I thought that would have been cute. But they never showed you the face of like the character. The character of Loretta, like when she was younger, we never got to see that. So, I mean, we saw like part of the face, but didn't really get like a real face reveal. So, but just from behind, I was like the blonde hair and everything. I was like, is that supposed to be Meryl Streep? Then it totally ended up being. So I thought that was interesting. It almost feels like there's almost this, like it's meant to almost be like this ironic role of like, I mean, because any actor, like, there are plenty of good actors who just haven't had their moment yet, which is really heartbreaking when you think about, like, I mean, that's the thing across any form of, like, the arts. Like, there's so many talented musicians or painters. There's so many people out there who just don't have that spotlight on them. So, but it's almost like this interesting thing where it's like you get, like, an actress of Meryl Streep's caliber, fantastic and extremely, like a ridiculously talented actress like her playing this character who just sadly never had her time to shine. And I wonder, does Meryl Streep kind of find some like in with that character? Because I'm not well versed enough, one, in her filmography in general, but also not as well versed in her earlier career, because there might be a lot of like parallels that she can like find within the character of like, oh yeah, like I'm sure plenty, even big time actors who've like, oh, like never, like they've had their moments here and there, but like, all it takes sometimes is just one role to really like change your entire life. Working from like, so it's just such an interesting thing when you kind of really break it down and thinking about it from like it's almost like there's a meta level to the whole situation I find so interesting. But that's most likely just me overthinking it. But obviously she came in just for like this nanny role, and I think it was like, I don't know if the character got extended or not, because it was supposed to only be like one scene, I think, or maybe just what she got was only one scene. You'd assume because I was saying, it sounds like the nanny might be, or at least she might be a suspect in the murder, and I think that's going to be a meta element where it seems like Loretta might be the number one suspect, but it's like too obvious, especially if she's playing the character who's potentially either a suspect or the actual killer in the play that they're playing. So there's that. But I do love that Oliver was like captivated by her, and you feel it. It's like, once again, it's always that interesting thing of when actors have to act. It's that thing of sometimes like actors have to act bad or make like interesting choices as actors acting a certain. It's so interesting later on when they're doing the table read and she's putting on accents and everyone's looking at her like, what are you doing? She was like, oh, I thought like, because it's this particular area, I put on like, what was it, like a Scottish accent or a French Canadian accent, which I just like, I love that. It's like, yeah, you take bold choices, you have to find that pocket that kind of really makes you kind of connect with the character. And she even said like, oh, this is my process to trying to find a voice for this character. So it's there, like I said, there's like this meta-ness to it. But I think it's so interesting. Like obviously we start off right off the bat. Obviously we're going to spend most of our time present day, obviously with the previous cases, and we kind of flash back. I'm curious like how much of the wasn't it like a year? I don't remember. It's been a while since the season 2 finale. Like, wasn't it like a year in between the season 2 finale and Ben's death? I was like, wasn't that supposed to be like a year or something like that? I could be mistaken, but because I know like the most we rewind in this episode was like 4 months ago, and that's when they were doing the table read. So, because at that point they'd already cast everyone, it was time for them all to kind of get together and everything. But I love like everyone has like different reactions to the whole situation. Charles is kind of be like, oh, it can't be murder or whatever. Mabel's immediately like, oh my God, this might actually be murder, which is so interesting considering like her line at the end of last season, because I didn't remember it until they showed it in the preview. She was like, you got to be fucking kidding me. That, it's like, right, just like immediately like came to a death situation. But especially for Oliver, he's freaking out, obviously, like, especially, I didn't even realize this until they pointed it out. I don't want to say it was the producer, Donna. She was like, yeah, it sucks that like this. I'm not saying that you're cursed or anything, but one of your leads in this dies on the same stage that your previous play, Splash, basically went kaput. Broadway show, Splash went kaput too. I was like, oh man, that's got to cut even deeper for Oliver, because like the place that was supposed to be your second chance, your redemption, ended up kind of shattering, And they kind of touched on it a tiny bit just with a look. We don't know what this means for Oliver's relationship with his son, like how much has kind of been, this whole production and how much time he's put towards it. We don't know how much that's kind of come in conflict with him and his son's relationship. So that's definitely going to be interesting to see that kind of get tackled. I'm sure that's something we'll tackle at some point. If not, because I haven't seen episode 2 of the season yet. I've only seen this one so far, so. I also love Howard being his assistant, because Howard tried to try out, but it's like, oh, and he's like, oh, do you remember, Howard was like, oh, do you remember what you said to me, Oliver? He was like, I think you'd be better served as my assistant. He's like, yeah, that's what you said, word for word. So it's like interesting. I love Howard being your assistant. I even love that he's in the opening as the one kind of walking the dog, and like in the opening title sequence. I was like, oh, I love that it's him. It's like, well, makes sense. No Bunny, so makes all the sense. Because it was obviously Bunny was killed at the end of season 1, but I was like, she was still in the opening for season 2, wasn't she? Maybe she wasn't. I'm just it's been a while, like, because I watched season 1 and season 2 pretty closely together, so it's been a while, so I might be misremembering. But I definitely noticed Oliver in the Howard in the opening credits. But yeah, like our like the table read, we got introduced. I was also surprised like how many there's so many familiar actors. I'm like, oh, you're in this, because I knew obviously because of season 1's finale that Ben would be played by Paul Rudd, which I think is so interesting. Where it's this meta thing of like, right, there's a lot of well-known actors, some playing themselves, others just playing like a different character, like. So I think it's like this almost meta thing too, where it's like, right, the apartment originally belonged to Sting, who was played by Sting. Then you had Amy Schumer playing herself. She was the next tenant. She bought it from, she bought the place from Sting, and now Ben ended up buying it from Amy Schumer, which I was like, that's so interesting. Because why not keep the trend going? Why isn't the person who bought it, why didn't they end up being someone just playing themselves, Why wasn't it just Paul Rudd playing Paul Rudd, or just some other actor, or just someone else being themselves? And I think that's so interesting, and maybe there's a particular reason for that. I think it's funny. I also love Uma's line. What was she was like? At least you guys had the decency to not have the person didn't die in the building. And Charles was like, yeah, like, oh, you're always kind of like, you always have like a wayward word to Uma. She's like, yeah, it's a goddamn gift. It's like, I miss your dry delivery and just your snart, Uma. I love it. Understandably, like, it's just like, right, this building's had to deal with 2 murders and dead bodies and stuff. And the moment she said that, I was like, yeah, it is interesting. How's that going to play out, considering, like, once again, the podcast, it's supposed to be about only the murders that take place in the building. So I'm like, how do you... But obviously, we resolved that by the end of the episode. But either way, diving into things. Going back to, like, other people who recognize, I saw Ashley Park. I was like, hey, that's so dope. So it feels so interesting, because I feel like I'm seeing her a lot more pop up and stuff, because I know she's in the movie. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, she might be I know she's one of the leads. She might even kind of be like the main character of the movie Joyride. I haven't seen it yet. I've heard nothing but good things about it being like hilarious and everything. But also I know she was in Beef. I'm blanking on her character's name in Beef, but I was like, oh, dude, seeing her in this too. Also Jesse Williams. He's Tobert, the camera guy. He's like, yeah, I love. Ben's like, yeah, you heard me right. It's like, yeah, Tobert's like, it's like Robert with a T, and he's like documenting Ben's making a documentary about the behind the scenes of his first play, because this play of Oliver's is his first play. I also love the producers, Donna and her son Cliff, and like Cliff does the bat flip and the front flip and everything, cartwheel and flip, and then like his mom is so proud of him when she kisses him on the face and then kisses him on the lips a couple of times, and she's like, it's okay, he's gay, so it's fine. And it's just like, no, it's still weird that you didn't just like kiss on the lips. You were kind of borderline making out, which is weird. But I guess like her justification for it's like, oh, because he's gay, like you don't have to worry about anything like weird mommy son thing happening between us. It doesn't stop that from being weird. The season's also introducing something kind of a sad element to Mabel's story, that she kind of misses hanging out with the guys. She's like, she misses her buddies because they haven't really been around each other that much. Like even near the end of the episode, like Oliver and Charles are going back and forth about like, oh yeah, like what happened to like that person, and because obviously things are good between Joy and Charles, which is nice to see that relationship has continued to blossom. But it's like, oh, what happened there? It's like they're talking about stuff kind of related to Joy, and Mabel kind of feels left out because she's like, oh, I don't get to hang out. You guys get to hang out all the time because obviously the play, but she doesn't really have a part in it. So, and I think it's just because like she kind of has no one, like every relationship's kind of blown up around her, so she's kind of in that empty place by herself. And I think for her, and maybe that's kind of like a part of her journey this season, it's like, yeah, like the only thing she really had going for her, like in her life currently, was like the podcast. And now that there was kind of nothing going on currently, that she wasn't even around Charles and Oliver that much, despite living in the same building. They didn't hang out that often. And it's like the other things she had in her life were tied to other stuff. Like, you know, like, I mean, we don't know if she really paints on her own anymore since like the place got redecorated like at the end of last season, and obviously it's spruced up even more because Mabel's like, yeah, she's moving out because her aunt is selling the place, and it's like, you know, she's like, yeah, I'll be like, you guys could come visit me from, you know, well, I could come visit you in Brooklyn or you in Queens, or maybe you guys can just, you know, I can come to you guys. But I think that's so interesting because she was even like immediately thinking like when Ben died, like, oh, maybe, you know, immediately went into murder mode, because even she was, I mean, like, you know, mystery solving mode rather, because she even said like, I mean, she's a big fan of Ben, so that's why she was excited for the table read, but none of the theater, none of that stuff really excites her. The only thing that excited about her was like, oh, it's a good murder mystery, so she was really into that, which obviously it's like very connected to its core of like how, right, they do a murder mystery podcast, you know, so a true crime murder mystery podcast, so you know, it fits. That's kind of been like murder and death has kind of surrounded her life, a good chunk of her life, but now it is something she still can't quite escape because it is something that is still a part of her life that she kind of dives into, and kind of finding something outside of that's kind of been the point, but she kind of hasn't. I don't think she's really talked to them about it too much, about how like lonely she's been. I mean, the fact is that she even tells Oliver, like the first thing that crossed my mind, it's like, yeah, like, oh, we could get the podcast back together and stuff. You know, I miss my guys. And Oliver's like, but which one of us do you miss more? And she's like, I can't choose between my old. He's like, right, I get it. Some things are better left unsaid. And he points to himself like, it's obviously me, right? So I thought that was sweet. Sitting here thinking about it, I was like, is this the first time I've ever seen, amongst the stuff I've seen of Paul Rudd, I'm trying to remember, is this the first time I've ever seen him play like a complete another douchebag? This might be. Because usually his characters can be, like, some characters he plays can be a little douchey, but they're still kind of lovable. This might be the first time he's played a straight-up asshole. Like, I would say, like, the closest, like, if I'm not mistaken, what, like, yeah, I Love You Man, where he was kind of a weirdo in that, but it's like, that's probably the closest I've seen him kind of play, like, I don't know. Once again, not well-versed in everything Paul Rudd, but I feel like that's definitely a role where I definitely remember. I mean, obviously with the nature of that movie and what that character is, that's one thing, but I'm not mistaken, like, right, I haven't seen that movie in so long, because I know, like, it's Jason Segel, but I was like, I was about to say Emily Blunt, but I'm like, it's Rashida Jones, right? Yeah. Because I was Emily Blunt, that's the 5-year engagement. Jesus, so many movies are blurring together in my mind. But it's like, yeah, like I think it was him, Jason Segel, Rashida Jones, and Paul Rudd. Like I said, I haven't seen that movie in so long, but I was like, yeah, I believe that other person, the one that was kind of like the obsessive friend, was like Paul Rudd, if I remember correctly. Either way, it's just like he's such a dick the way he kind of strolls in, and he's just like kind of that cocky, entitled douchebag. And so the way he was also talking to Loretta, you're kind of like, they were already setting the stage of like, right, she's going to be like your number one suspect, especially the opening where Oliver is talking about someone chasing their dream, and once they get it, like, what are they willing to do? They're willing to do whatever it takes to keep it. And it's like, so she definitely is at the top of the suspect list, and it's going to be a major red herring because it seems too obvious, but maybe that's going to be the red herring of it seems too obvious, and maybe because it seemed too obvious, it's ultimately going to end up being the case. We'll have to wait and see. It's also interesting, too, because they kind of set up that Loretta and Oliver kind of have a thing, but the only thing keeping them from, like, taking that next step is the professionalism of, oh, we're working together and we shouldn't, like, mix business with pleasure and something personal like that. But, you know, because she was like, right, now that that's all past, we can be together. So, because this play meant a lot for them, it was a big opportunity for Loretta, but it's also a big, once again, redemption arc for Oliver, and even him trying to pep her up after like the table read kind of went sideways because Ben's like, yo, you gotta like. You kind of got to get rid of her. She's not good. She's going to kind of like sink everything. And it's like, oh yeah, like there was some kid who was nervous and, you know, everyone was telling me to fire him, but I didn't. And you know what happened? It's like, actually he ended up being kind of pretty bad and it didn't work out. So I had to fire him 3 weeks later, but that's not going to be you, Loretta. Like you're so much better. What I was super surprised by was the sudden thing of Ben showing up later alive. I was like, I didn't see that coming. I was like, you're going to end up dying again, but still, like, holy crap, that's an interesting way to twist that, where it's like, hey, the guy who's potentially, he's like, oh, it might have been something he ate. It's like, yo, what about the blood in your mouth? He's like, oh yeah, because when I fell, I basically bit my tongue. I was like, that's interesting. I was like, wow, okay. So I was like, because I thought the way he was going to go around, like, talking to everybody, he's making amends of, like, oh, I've been a douchebag to everyone. Like, him and Ashley Park's characters, like, there was something going on there. He got pissed at the other dude because it's like, hey, you were asking for my trainer. I wasn't a big fan of that. Even talking to Jonathan, it's like, you were my understudy. And I'm going to be honest with you. I was going to make damn sure that you never stepped foot on the stage, you know. I was trying to make sure, like, I always stayed and you never got your chance. But he's like, don't. But now that I'm having this epiphany, I might actually consider it now. Went around to Loretta and called her a snake, which is interesting because, like, their first conversation was her calling him the Cobra or whatever. And he's like, oh, yeah, just Cobra. And she's like, excuse me? He's like, yeah, putting a the in front of it, just what am I, an asshole? You know, like The Rock or the Pope. It's like, come on, get over yourself. It's like, Jesus. Obviously, like, a number one suspect seems to be his brother, but that seems a little too obvious, especially because you look at it, just from what we've seen, it looks like his brother's kind of his lapdog. It's just kind of like, oh, you have to do all this stuff for me. And it's like, oh, yeah, I know what people say, nepotism and blah, 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 blah. So, it's going to be interesting. Like, I'm immediately striking him and Loretta off the list, but like I said, Loretta seems like the obvious choice, but that might be because it's like, right, it's so obvious, you would think, like, it can't be, but plenty of people with motivation, because we haven't gotten a peek behind everything in those 4 months between the table read, because that was the first time he was meeting the rest of the cast. So there'll probably be some lead up. We'll rewind back to it. Like I said, if I'm not mistaken, it's like a year, might be more, but I want to say it was like a year in between the finale, in that time skip in between the solving of the last case and Ben's quote unquote death. It was really his first death. So there's still, like, math, 8 months before that still can be filled in. Like I said, we only rewound to about 4 months ago during the table read. I doubt it's just going to be in that 4 month period. I'm sure, like, probably a majority of it will be, but there's probably going to be a lot, like, beforehand, kind of leading up to, like, the table read, explaining how a lot of people got there in the first place. Probably catching up. I mean, I don't know if we'll dive in Loretta's past a lot, considering like we'll probably get some in between stuff of how she got to where she's, but we already kind of got that a little bit with the montage at the beginning of the episode. So I don't know. Like I said, also catching up with like Charles and Oliver and even Mabel, kind of the life she's kind of led separate to the podcast, and Charles and Oliver, and how she's kind of handled all of it without the others really being aware. I wonder, are we going to get her aunt this season? Because they're making the whole point of like, right, her aunt selling it. So I'd assume like maybe her aunt might be like a guest character this season. And I'm wondering who it would be. Unless I'm being stupid. Like, we haven't met her aunt before, right? I think so, because her aunt's just never been here. If I'm not mistaken. And I could easily be mistaken. And maybe I'm just being stupid. But I'm like, you would assume, if that's something that's kind of known, like, I don't want to know it. I'm just asking rhetorically. Like I said, if I'm not being an idiot and it hasn't already come up beforehand. But if it's something like new, like, oh, her aunt will be in this season, like, don't tell me. I don't want to know who it is. I want to be surprised type of situation. So. But I do love this stinger at the end where it's like, even Charles immediately being like, yeah, Mabel, the whole podcast thing wouldn't have worked because, yeah, Ben didn't die in the apartment. And lo and behold, he died in the apartment building. And Uma happens to be there. She's like, you've got to be fucking kidding me. It's like, you guys are a damn plague. Maybe it's not Oliver that's cursed. Maybe it's all three of you. You know? I mean, to be fair, it was only Mabel around when Bunny died. But it's still like you trio. I mean, to be fair, Mabel was obviously looking at herself as a bit of a curse last season because so much death happened around her, so. I mean, especially because the fan base was asking all these questions about where they'd been. It's like, well, there hadn't been any murders in the building, so can't really. It's a very niche and very specific podcast that you can't continue, you know? And once again, maybe it'd be a little bit of a meta thing of like, oh, you went off a hiatus, or maybe you've lost a step, because they made a whole point last season where their main fans were like, oh yeah, like this season seems kind of predictable, and it's like, oh, how they went about telling us stuff that the audience figured out before the main characters did, or before the reveal happened, like stuff like that. So it's probably gonna be a thing of, oh, they've taken this time off. Oh, this third season's not nearly as good as like the first. Second season was fine, not as good as the first season, and this season seems like it's going to probably be worse, and it's just they've lost a step or two because it's a new. Oh, that's the danger of something going on for an extent. Like, you could get super meta with it, which the show's always gotten meta with how layered it is, so you can play with that even more in that capacity. So, you know, the super fans have to pop up at some point in time and kind of understanding what's kind of going on through their lives. I think that's going to be an interesting thing too, because maybe the fans have kind of moved on. Like, some of the major fans, like, they still hit up like the forums about the podcast, but what their lives are like, them, you know, waiting on bated breath for like the new season of the podcast, and that interesting parallel of like, oh, even those who were waiting for the podcast had their lives, and Mabel technically didn't live a life, kind of. I mean, once again, we don't fully know what's happening in between the seasons for her, but it could easily just be a thing of everyone else is kind of moving on, found that next thing, and she's the one that's just kind of been stuck in limbo. So I think that would just be kind of an interesting route for them to potentially take. I don't even have an inkling of what to kind of expect from this season. I avoided watching the trailer for this season. Just, you know, wanted to know as little as possible. So I'm very, very excited to get into the next episode after this. But I'm very excited to have Only Murders in the Building back, and I'm so excited to see where this season ultimately ends up taking us. But really, that's all I wanted to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and goodbye.